Have you ever noticed that just before life transforms completely, everything suddenly feels heavier, not lighter, as if some invisible force is pressing down on your chest right when you expect to finally breathe? Most of us believe that when we're on the edge of something beautiful, we'll feel it coming. The air will clear, the fog will lift, the path will straighten out in front of us like a road finally paved. But that's not how it works. The deepest shifts in a human life don't announce themselves with fireworks. They arrive in silence. They move through you like water moving through stone, not breaking, but reshaping. And by the time you notice what's happened, you're already standing on the other side of something you didn't even know you were crossing. Carl Jung understood this better than almost anyone. He saw that the most beautiful season of a person's life doesn't begin when circumstances become perfect. It begins when you stop pretending, when you stop performing, when you stop living according to someone else's blueprint, and start, finally, living close to the bone of who you actually are. That's the moment you stop fighting what's already finished. Stop measuring your worth through other people's eyes. Stop being afraid of the quiet places inside you that you've been running from for years. These changes aren't loud, but they are real, and once they begin, your entire existence slowly tilts in a new direction. Not because you forced it, but because you finally stopped getting in your own way. In this video, we're going to walk through 7 quiet signs that you may be much closer to the most authentic chapter of your life than you realize. Have you felt something shifting lately, but couldn't quite name it? Stay until the end, and you'll understand why the softest movements inside your own soul are often the clearest signals that a new phase, deeper, freer, more genuinely yours, is already beginning to unfold. Sign 1. You release what hurts without needing to punish. The first sign arrives like this. You let go of something that once consumed you, not because you made a heroic decision one morning, but because one day you simply notice you're not carrying it anymore. Not because you forgot, not because you decided it didn't matter, but because somewhere along the way, you stopped wanting to drag it with you. You still remember. The memory is still there, but it no longer triggers the same storm inside you. You can talk about what happened without your voice tightening. You can sit with the story without needing to prove you were wronged, without needing anyone to validate your pain, without needing to win an argument that ended years ago. And in that quiet softening, something profound has occurred. You've left the prison you built. But here's what most people never realize. Resentment doesn't protect your dignity. It just keeps you chained to the version of yourself that was hurt. Most of us don't hold on to old wounds because we enjoy suffering. We hold on because we're afraid that letting go means accepting injustice. That if we stop being angry, we're saying what happened was okay. That without the grudge, the story becomes meaningless. But Jung saw something different. He understood that resentment doesn't preserve meaning, it preserves bondage. It keeps you tethered to an older self, a self shaped entirely by pain, a self that exists only in relation to what was done to you. You're not just remembering the past, you're inviting it into every present moment. You're letting it color how you trust, how you love, how you see every new person who walks into your life. Let me tell you about a man I once met in a quiet bookstore on a rainy afternoon. His name was David. He'd been through a divorce that nearly destroyed him. Not because of the separation itself, but because of how it happened. The betrayal. The lies. The way she looked at him like he was a stranger. For years he rehearsed the story. He told it to friends, to therapists, to anyone who would listen. Not because he wanted sympathy, but because he needed someone to confirm that he wasn't crazy. That what happened was real. That he had been wronged. But when I saw him that afternoon, years later, something was different. We talked for an hour before the subject even came up. And when it did, his voice didn't change. His posture didn't tighten. He simply said, I think the hardest part wasn't losing her. It was accepting that some stories don't end the way they should. And that's just how it is. He didn't justify. He didn't blame. He didn't try to make it sound reasonable or fair. He just let it sit there, like a door that had finally closed. That's what release looks like. Not fireworks. Not dramatic declarations. Just a quiet recognition that you've stopped living in a room you left years ago. Jung once wrote that we cannot change anything until we accept it. Condemnation doesn't free you. It suffocates you. When you're still resentful, you're still fighting reality. You're keeping a part of yourself in a place that has already ended. But that fight doesn't change the past. It only makes you carry it forward, year after year, until the weight becomes so familiar you forget you're even holding it. Imagine this. You're wearing a coat that once kept you warm. It fit perfectly during a certain season of your life. But now, years later, you've grown. Your shoulders are broader. Your body has changed. And that coat, which you once loved, now feels tight, restrictive. Every time you move, it pulls against you. But you keep wearing it. Because it's familiar. Because it meant something once. Because taking it off feels like admitting that part of your life is over. Letting go without resentment is the moment you finally take that coat off. Not because you've figured everything out, not because you've forgiven everyone, but because you no longer need to keep proving that you were cold. Can you feel how much lighter you become when you stop wearing what no longer fits? You stop waiting for an apology that's never coming. Stop demanding that the past makes sense. Stop needing the story to have a neat ending. You accept that some things end the way they end. Not the way you wanted, not the way they should have, but ended nonetheless. And from that place, something shifts. You no longer react to old wounds. You no longer see the present through the filter of what once hurt you. You begin to experience life as it is, not as it was, not as you fear it might become, but simply as it is. The deepest meaning of this sign isn't that you've moved on. It's that you no longer need that story to define who you are. You're no longer the person something happened to. You're just the person who lived through it and kept walking. And from there, a new phase begins to take shape. Not through dramatic changes on the outside, but through a genuine lightness on the inside. You move forward without being pulled backward. You look ahead without needing to turn around and fix anything behind you. This quiet shift is the clearest sign that you are moving very close to the most authentic chapter of your life. Sign 2. You stop living inside other people's expectations. When you've begun to release what no longer belongs to you, another change appears. Quieter than the first, but even more transformative. You stop arranging your life around how others see you. Not because you've become cold or disconnected, but because you no longer need their approval to feel that you're okay. A subtle distance begins to form between you and the opinions around you. You still listen. You still care. But you're no longer pulled along by every glance, every comment, every unspoken expectation. Have you ever noticed how exhausting it is to constantly calculate whether you're being perceived correctly? And within that delicate distance, something remarkable happens. For the first time, you begin to feel yourself more clearly. Not through the mirror of other people's reactions, but directly from the inside out. Most people don't realize they're living under this kind of influence. It doesn't come from obvious pressure. It comes from things that feel completely normal. A compliment that makes you double down on a certain behavior. A skeptical look that makes you second-guess yourself. A cultural standard of success that makes you reshape your dreams without anyone even asking. Gradually, you stop asking yourself, what do I actually want? And you start asking, will this be accepted? And from Jung's perspective, this is exactly how a person loses contact with their own self. The ego no longer moves from within. It's led by collective patterns, by the expectations of the crowd, by the unlived lives of the people who raised you. Think about the novel Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. The protagonist lives a life that everyone around him would call admirable. He's the perfect son, the brilliant student, walking the path that society and tradition have praised for generations. Yet deep inside, he feels an emptiness that nothing can fill. Not because that life is wrong, but because he's never truly lived it as his own truth. He's been performing a role, not living a life. And the moment he leaves, the moment he walks away from everything that was supposed to make him happy, it's not an act of rebellion against the world. It's the first time he's been honest with himself. Jung once wrote that the heaviest burden a child carries is the unlived life of the parents. Think about that. When you live beneath other people's expectations, you're not just carrying their demands. You're carrying the parts of them they never had the courage to live. You become a continuation of standards you never chose, a vessel for dreams that were never yours. And this doesn't only come from family. It's everywhere. In every space where you learned to become a version that's easily accepted, instead of a version that's genuinely yourself. Imagine you're reading from a script that was written before you were born. Every line has been set. Every step has been mapped. All you have to do is follow it, and you'll never make a mistake. You'll never be criticized. You'll never be rejected. But the more you perform, the more you feel a gap between yourself and the role you're playing. Do you know that feeling? When you're succeeding at something that doesn't actually matter to you. Not because the script is bad, but because it's not your story. And the moment you stop reading from that script isn't the moment you lose your direction. It's the moment you begin, for the first time, to write your own life. When you no longer live beneath other people's gaze, you don't become indifferent. You simply become more honest. You stop explaining every choice just to be understood. You stop bending yourself to avoid being judged. Your decisions start coming from a quieter place inside, where the question is no longer what will they think, but does this fit the person I'm becoming? From there, you also begin to see yourself more clearly. Not through comparison, not through the images other people have placed on you, but directly, honestly, without the noise. And isn't that what you've wanted all along? Not to be seen as someone, but to actually be someone. This doesn't separate you from the world. On the contrary, it allows you to be more real in every relationship. Because when you stop trying to become someone else in order to be accepted, only then can you build connections that are built not on performance, but on truth. What you need to do now is simple. Before each important choice, just slow down for a moment. Look at what's guiding you. Inner clarity, or the fear of being judged. Just by seeing that honestly, you've already begun walking back toward yourself. And if you're in this phase now, slowly living more truthfully, even though so much is still uncertain, can you feel how much lighter it is on this side? Sign 3. You can be alone without feeling empty. The moment you stop needing another person to fill the void inside you, something extraordinary begins to open. Not loudly, not all at once, but truly. You can still be with others. You can still connect. You can still love deeply, but you're no longer afraid of being by yourself. Silence no longer makes you uneasy. Empty spaces no longer make you reach for your phone, turn on the television, or call someone just to hear a voice. When was the last time you sat in complete silence, not doing anything, and felt completely fine? And in that quiet sense of fullness, you begin to touch a kind of freedom you've never known before. Most people aren't actually afraid of being alone. They're afraid of facing themselves when no one else is there to soften what's happening inside. Because when the noise stops, when the distractions fade, unresolved thoughts, suppressed feelings, and the parts of yourself you've never really looked at, they all rise to the surface. That's why so many people fill every empty moment with conversation, with scrolling, with work, with noise. Not because they're busy, but because they're running. Jung believed that the ability to be alone without feeling empty is the mark of an inner world that is slowly becoming whole. I once received a message from someone who had been following this work. She wrote that in the past, she couldn't stand being alone for even an hour. The moment there was no one to talk to, she felt a crushing emptiness. She would text friends, scroll through social media, put on podcasts, anything to avoid the silence. But after some time of simply observing herself, not judging, just watching, she realized something. What made her uncomfortable wasn't the silence. It was the things inside her that she'd never truly faced. And then, very slowly, she stopped running. She started sitting in the silence for a few minutes at a time, not forcing anything, just being there. And one day, she realized she could sit still for an hour without feeling the absence of anyone. Not because she had become cold or isolated, but because she had finally become company for herself. Jung once said that loneliness doesn't come from having no one around you. It comes from being unable to communicate the things that matter most to you. And when you don't understand yourself, when you haven't made peace with yourself, then even in a room full of people, you can feel utterly lost. But when you begin to be with yourself without feeling empty, then even in silence, you feel whole. Imagine you've been wearing headphones your entire adult life. Music, podcasts, conversations, notifications, something always playing. You've become so accustomed to constant noise that the moment you take the headphones off, you feel a strange discomfort, as if something important is missing. But then, slowly, you start leaving them off a little longer. At first, it feels strange, unsettling. You notice how loud your own mind can be. But when you stop rushing to fill the silence, you begin to realize something. What if silence isn't absence? What if it's the first time you can actually hear yourself? When you can be alone without feeling a void, you don't become distant from the world. On the contrary, you begin to connect with others in a completely different way. You no longer go to people to fill yourself up. You go because you genuinely want to share, to be present, to walk beside them, not because you need them to complete you. You stop clinging, stop fearing loss. Stop trying to hold on to what no longer fits just because you're afraid of returning to yourself. You begin entering relationships from a place of fullness, not from lack. Psychologically, this is a crucial step in inner maturation. When you no longer depend on the presence of others to feel okay, you recover a very deep kind of self-possession. Your emotions no longer rise and fall entirely based on whether someone is there or absent. You begin to have a center within, a place you can return to no matter what's happening outside. Can you imagine how much peace comes from no longer being held hostage by other people's availability? This doesn't mean you don't need anyone. Human beings still need connection, still need love, still need to be understood. But the difference is this: you no longer need another person to complete you. You're already a whole being. And relationships become a gift added to your life, not a compensation for what's missing. The lesson here isn't to learn how to separate yourself from the world. It's to learn how to be with yourself without feeling empty. Because when you can be alone and still feel whole, you're no longer forced to search for someone just to avoid loneliness. And from there, every connection you create afterwards becomes more real, lighter, and far freer. Sign 4. You start seeing purpose in what you've lived through. If you've reached the point where you can be alone without feeling empty, something even deeper begins to unfold. You stop just surviving the past. You start reading the hidden meaning inside it. This doesn't happen while everything is still raw. When a painful event has just occurred, all you can see is loss, confusion, the feeling that your life has veered off course into somewhere it was never supposed to go. But over time, when the emotion no longer takes up all the space inside you, another way of seeing begins to emerge. You no longer remember only what happened. You begin to see how it quietly changed you. What once felt like random fragments slowly starts to connect, as if everything is no longer a collection of broken pieces, but parts of the same journey. Think about Homer's Odyssey. Odysseus spends years trying to return home after the Trojan War. On the surface, it's a story of delay, loss, and endless detours. He gets trapped. He gets sidetracked. He loses everything multiple times. But the deeper you look, the more you realize something. Without passing through those lost years, without the wandering, without the suffering, Odysseus could never have returned as the same man who departed. What matters isn't only whether he reaches home. It's who he becomes after everything he's been through. Have you ever looked back at something that nearly broke you and realized it also made you? Life is often like that. When you're in the middle of a difficult season, all you see is what you're losing, how you're being pushed away from what you hoped for, how you're being forced to walk a road you never would have chosen. But then one day, looking back, you begin to understand. Some things only reveal their meaning after you've gone through them. Not to make the pain look beautiful, not to romanticize suffering, but to show you that it quietly changed the way you love, the way you trust, the way you see life itself. Jung had a line that speaks directly to this moment. He said that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside as fate. In other words, the things that feel like blind destiny, the random suffering, the senseless losses, only stop feeling random when you're brave enough to look inward. When you're honest enough to ask not just why did this happen to me, but what did this awaken in me? And from there, what happened is no longer just an event to endure. It becomes a part of your journey that can be understood and placed back in its proper place within the story of your life. Imagine your life as a book that's still being written. When you're in the middle of a dark chapter, all you can see are tangled passages, unfinished sentences, details that seem to lead nowhere. There are pages you want to tear out entirely because they don't resemble the story you once hoped to have. But no one can understand a book by reading only one chapter in the middle. Only when you keep going, and then one day look back, do you begin to understand why those pages had to exist. Not to ruin the whole story, but to make it deeper, truer, and closer to your essential self. That doesn't mean you have to feel grateful for every pain. Not every wound is beautiful. Not every loss should be romanticized. But if you refuse to see any meaning in what you've gone through, it will remain only a burden, a weight you drag behind you forever. What if the wound itself, properly understood, becomes a kind of wisdom? And when you're honest enough to look back, at some point it will no longer be merely a wound. It will become a deeper understanding living inside you. That's the lesson of this sign. Maturity isn't forgetting what you've lived through. It's seeing why you needed to pass through it in order to become the person you are now. When you begin to see the meaning in your former journey, the past is no longer something that drags you backward. It becomes the quiet ground that lifts you up. Thank you for staying with me through half of this journey. If at this point, an old experience in your life suddenly appears before you with a different meaning, then perhaps within you, a very quiet door has just opened as well. When was the last time you saw meaning in something that once only hurt you? Take a moment. Be honest with yourself. Sometimes when you rewrite an old stretch of road through a new gaze, you don't only remember what is past, you also understand more clearly the person you became through it all. Sign 5. You touch A still, open space deep inside. When you begin to see meaning in what you've lived through, you don't always feel relieved right away. There's a very particular phase that appears afterward, where everything inside you seems to settle. No longer too many questions. No longer too many reactions. Just a very still, open space. And the strange thing is, this time, you don't rush to fill it. Most of us are used to needing something happening inside ourselves at all times. A thought, a feeling, a goal, a worry. Business doesn't only exist outside us, it also runs continuously in the inner world. So when emptiness appears, the first reflex is to fill it. To keep thinking, keep doing, keep searching. But when you begin to touch a more mature stage of inner growth, you're no longer afraid of that space. You start to realize it's not absence, it's stillness. I once worked with a woman named Sarah during a meditation practice. She told me that within just a few minutes of sitting quietly, her shoulders would tighten, her hands would clench, and her breathing would become hurried. She said what made her uncomfortable wasn't the silence outside. It was the feeling that inwardly, there was suddenly nothing left to hold on to. But after several weeks of consistent practice, just sitting, not trying to achieve anything, something shifted. One day, she stopped trying to fill the empty space. She simply sat, let her shoulders soften, let her breathing slow down, and remained there a little longer than usual. Then she smiled and said something I've never forgotten. I always thought there was a frightening emptiness inside me, but it turns out it's not frightening at all. It's just very still. Jung once wrote that the pendulum of the mind swings between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong. But the still, open space within you doesn't lie at either end of that swing. It lies at the point where you're no longer carried away by it, where you no longer need to cling to anything in order to feel that you exist. From a scientific perspective, when the brain is no longer being continuously stimulated, it shifts into what's called the default mode network. This is the state where you're not focused on any specific task. You're simply turned inward. And what do people find there when they stop running? In those who have practiced being still long enough, this state becomes very quiet. It's not a lack of awareness. It's awareness no longer being dragged along by a constant stream of thought. And it's precisely in that state that people often feel their own presence most clearly. Imagine your mind as the surface of a lake. Most of the time, the water is always rippling. Thoughts, emotions, worries, memories, continuously disturbing the surface. You're so used to looking at those ripples that you begin to believe they are the whole lake. But when the wind falls still, the lake becomes flat. And for the first time you can see through the surface, down into a depth you never noticed before. That still, open space inside you is like that. It's not the absence of something. It's the moment when movement temporarily quiets down so that you can see your true depth. When you reach this state, you no longer react immediately to everything that happens. You're no longer swept away by every thought that appears. There's a subtle pause between what happens and how you respond. And that pause creates a very different kind of freedom. You no longer live by reflex. You begin to live more consciously, though very quietly. What matters is this: the state isn't loud. It doesn't create the feeling that you've achieved something great. It feels so ordinary that many people overlook it entirely. But if you're sensitive enough to notice it, you'll see that it's one of the clearest signs that your inner world is changing. You no longer need too much in order to feel full. You no longer need to keep becoming someone. You only need to be there, and that is enough. What you need to do now is very simple. Can you spare 5 minutes today? Each day, choose 5 minutes without holding your phone. Just sit quietly in a familiar place. Don't try to meditate correctly. Don't demand that you feel peaceful right away. You only need to be there and be honest with whatever is arising inside. If it's restlessness, recognize that you're restless. If it's a vague emptiness, let it be present exactly as it is. Then the day will come when you realize this. The stillness within is not an empty space to run from. It's the deepest place where your soul is quietly finding its way back to itself. Sign 6. You stop forcing life to follow your plan. When the stillness within becomes deep enough, you begin to realize something unexpected. Not everything in life needs to be forced into correctness in order to have meaning. In the past, you may have lived in a state of constant effort, trying to keep everything within your grasp. Keep a person from leaving. Keep a plan from going off course. Keep a result arriving exactly on time. You believed that if you just tried a little harder, were a little smarter, endured a little longer, life would eventually follow the tracks you laid down for it. But over time, you begin to grow tired. Not only because everything is hard, but because you realize that some things become more distorted the more you try to force them. Have you ever gripped something so tightly that you actually pushed it away? Most people don't force life because they want to control everything. They force it because they fear uncertainty. They fear things moving away from what they expected. Fear losing what they're clinging to. Fear that if they don't hold on tightly enough, everything will fall apart. But the longer you live, the more you understand. Not everything stays just because you try hard enough. And not every turn that seems wrong is truly leading you astray. Think about the filmmaker Christopher Nolan. He's known for his precise storytelling and his almost absolute control over structure. But in films like Interstellar, what makes viewers stay isn't only the precision. It's the parts he doesn't try to explain completely. The ambiguous spaces. The emotions that aren't entirely sealed shut. Sometimes what truly touches people doesn't lie in perfect control. It lies in allowing something to live according to its own depth. Jung had a line that fits this state perfectly. He said that in all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order. There are times when life looks as if it's moving away from all your expectations, but the more deeply you enter your own journey, the more you understand that not everything outside your control is wrong. There are deeper forms of order that only reveal themselves when you stop forcing everything to happen according to your will. Imagine you're trying to bend a young tree into exactly the shape you want. You tie it down. You pull it sideways. You force it to grow in a predetermined direction. For a while it can endure that. But if you keep forcing it for too long, the tree will either break or grow into a twisted form. Life is like that too. There are things that need direction, but cannot be forced. There are phases that require perseverance, but cannot be dragged endlessly toward your side. And maturity sometimes means recognizing the very delicate boundary between effort and coercion. Can you feel the difference between pushing and simply persisting? When you no longer force life to go your way, you don't become passive. This is very important. You still act, still choose, still move forward. But within you, there's no longer a rigid tension that demands everything unfold exactly according to plan. You do what you can do. Then you allow the rest to return to its rightful place. You no longer see every deviation as failure. You don't treat a change of direction as an insult to your ego. You begin to understand that sometimes what doesn't go your way isn't necessarily wrong. It may simply be leading you elsewhere. This also changes how you move through uncertain phases. In the past, you may have feared the feeling of not knowing. You wanted the answer immediately, the conclusion immediately, certainty about where everything was going. But now, you gradually accept that there are roads which can only be understood after you've walked through them. You stop demanding that life explain itself too soon. You allow yourself to live in an unclear space without rushing to call it wrong. And strangely enough, the moment you stop forcing, you begin to move in better rhythm with what truly belongs to you. The lesson of this sign isn't surrender. It's learning to place your strength in the right place. Some things require perseverance. Some things require letting go. Some things disappear the tighter you grip them. And some things only arrive when you're calm enough to stop chasing them. What in your life right now are you forcing that might actually unfold more beautifully if you simply allowed it? What you need to do now is this. Before whatever is making you tense, slow down for a moment. Look honestly. Are you truly making an effort, or are you trying to force life to answer in the way you want? Simply seeing that difference will spare you a great deal of suffering. Sign 7. You carry a steadiness that needs no validation. After everything you've lived through, something very quiet begins to form. You no longer feel the need to prove who you are. In the past, you may have lived in a very familiar state, always wanting others to understand you, acknowledge you, see your worth. You tried to explain more clearly, do better, express yourself more fully. Not because you wanted to compete, but because a part of you still needed confirmation that you were enough. But over time, after the moments of not being understood, the times you were misjudged, the moments when you gave your all and still couldn't change how others saw you, you begin to realize something very real. Some things don't need to be proven in order to be true. Most people don't try to prove themselves because they're strong. They do it because inwardly, there is still a very small insecurity. A part of them still wants to lean on the external gaze in order to feel stable. But what happens when you stop needing anyone to confirm your worth? When you've gone through enough experience, you begin to shift. You no longer place your center in what others think of me. You begin to place it elsewhere, somewhere quieter, deeper, where you don't need anyone's confirmation to know who you are. I once saw this in a very ordinary person. In the past, he always wanted to explain everything clearly, always wanted other people to understand him correctly. He would over-explain, over-justify, overcompensate. But over time, he changed. Not because he no longer had opinions, but because he no longer needed to speak out on every single thing. When he was misunderstood, he no longer rushed to correct it immediately. When he wasn't acknowledged, he no longer felt the need to prove more. And the strange thing was this. He didn't become quiet because he had grown weaker. He became quiet because he was no longer driven by the need to be seen. He was simply there. Very ordinary, yet deeply steady. Jung once said that the shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. When you understand this, you no longer try to make everyone understand you in the same way. You also stop trying to force yourself into some model just to be more widely accepted. You begin to accept that each person will see you through their own lens. And that no longer shakes you. Imagine yourself as a tree whose roots have grown deep enough. In the past, when the roots were shallow, you were easily affected by the wind, by change, by whatever was happening around you. You needed the environment to be stable in order to feel stable yourself. But when the roots have gone deep into the earth, you no longer depend entirely on the surface. The wind still blows. The seasons still change. But you're no longer dragged along by every movement. You don't need to prove that you're standing firm. You simply stand firm. When you carry a steadiness that no longer needs validation, you don't become cold or detached. You still connect, still care, still remain present. But you no longer do those things in order to be acknowledged. You no longer need to become a certain version of yourself to meet expectations. You no longer react intensely when you're judged unfairly. You understand that no one can fully see all that you are. And that is no longer a problem. What kind of freedom lives in that acceptance? What's special is that this state is very quiet. It doesn't need display, doesn't need to impress, doesn't need attention. But others can feel it. A person who no longer needs to prove themselves carries a very different energy. They're not rushed, not tense, not trying. They speak when it's time to speak, fall silent when it's time to be silent. And that naturalness itself creates a very real kind of magnetism. The lesson here isn't to become someone who needs no one. It's to no longer need validation in order to know who you are. You may still be loved, understood, and acknowledged, but you no longer depend on those things to stand firmly. You already have an inner point of support, not because you're perfect, but because you've accepted yourself more fully. And from here, you begin to live in a very different way. You no longer chase becoming someone. You no longer try to fit into some image. You simply live as yourself, very quietly, but very truly. And perhaps that is the clearest sign of all that you have entered the phase where life is no longer the place where you search for value. It's the place where you live from the value already present within you. Conclusion. In closing, the most beautiful thing Jung points toward is not a life without storms. It's a life in which you are no longer lost to yourself. These 7 signs are not miracles arriving from outside. They are very quiet inner movements, moments where you begin to let go. Stop resisting, stop forcing, and gradually return closer to your true self. It's not the moment when everything becomes perfect. It's the moment when you begin to live truthfully. And perhaps the most beautiful phase of life doesn't arrive when you have more. It arrives when you no longer have to trade yourself away in order to hold on to anything. When you're deep enough to understand what you've lived through, quiet enough to be alone without feeling empty, steady enough to keep walking without needing to prove yourself. From that place, another chapter of life begins to open. Very quietly, but very truly. Can you feel it? The subtle turning, the slow lightening, the sense that you're not lost at all, but finally arriving. If today you feel that some of these signs are already present within you, don't rush to doubt them. Perhaps you're not lost at all. Perhaps right now, your life is quietly turning toward its most authentic chapter. And if you want to continue going deeper with me into the mysteries of the soul through the lens of Carl Jung, press like, subscribe, and stay with me for the videos to come. Because sometimes, all it takes is one moment of daring to look deeply enough within, and you will touch the very self you have been searching for all this time.